Getting it started, and thanks for that impassioned pitch at the end about more work that we need to do, because we do have to focus on this issue more broadly, not only in the connection between domestic violence and intimate partner violence, whatever descriptions you want to use, but and also the connection to gun violence. We need to focus on both individually, but also focus on them jointly. We're doing that today. I just wanted to say a couple things I'll say a little bit about policy and maybe just two numbers, because there's so many numbers. But let me just start on more of a, we're here at a Link Family Center, so we should start on that basis. This issue to me, and it's usually the following. This is a scenario: a man engaging in violence against a woman who happens to be his wife or his girlfriend or very close to him. That act is an act of betrayal in so many ways. It's the ultimate kind of betrayal to commit an act or act of violence against someone who is close to them, and that makes it more difficult to hold that perpetrator accountable. Someone who's often physically not as strong, they can't defend themselves against that kind of violence, or unfortunately in so many cases, someone who can't defend themselves against a gun, a speeding bullet. So it is the ultimate act of betrayal, but all of us, especially elected officials, I'll start with elected officials, but also include everyone else as well as citizens, but especially people that have elected office and have some degree of power, some degree of opportunity to do something about this. When we don't act on this, when we don't fund programs, we need money. You can't just talk and give speeches and talk about efficiency. You've got to talk about funding and dollars and resources. When we don't fund programs, when we don't insist that programs work, it's not good enough to fund a program that's not working. When we don't do our job, we enlarge or exacerbate that betrayal. Okay, so this isn't just a betrayal within a family. We're all part of this problem if we're not doing something about it. That old expression, you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Secondly, when I think about it in terms of my own life, I almost had trouble coming up with enough words of gratitude for the life that I was fortunate to lead as a child. My father put my mother on such a pedestal that the only offense you could commit, to talk back to her, to show her any degree, any level, any scintilla of disrespect. That was the ultimate crime in his family, so to speak. So we learned that pretty early, that if you disrespected her, you were in big trouble. You could crash the car, you could get a low grade, you could do all kinds of things and get in trouble, and he would kind of put that aside and maybe give you a little lecture. But one thing you could never do is show disrespect his wife and our mother. And that should be the norm, or that should at least be the goal for every single family. There's no excuse for a man to engage in any level of abuse, verbal or physical or otherwise. I remember sitting in a college class years ago, and it was a theology class, so this person knew a lot about scriptures and knew a lot about issues that when you're in college you don't think a lot about. And he was a brilliant man, but one time he said something so simple that it stays with me 30,000 years later after college. He said, the most important lesson a child can learn from their father is that the father loves the mother. And that about says it all. And unless we have the kind of passion and determination and sense of urgency on an issue like this to reach that kind of a goal, then we're not doing our job as public officials. And Bob Freeman is here from the General Assembly, a great member who's worked hard on these and other issues, and I know he'd agree with me. We have our job to do, but I also think as citizens and as part of a society, we need to develop a stronger culture of intolerance for this kind of violence. To take the approach that Moms Demand Action have taken on gun violence, and your predecessors took on Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It used to be more acceptable in the United States of America to drive a car, to operate a motor vehicle under the influence. It was not that, it might have been illegal, but it was not a societal, it wasn't looked down on the way it is today. Today, the law doesn't tolerate it, nor do we as a society. We should take the same approach to domestic violence and to gun violence. And unfortunately, today we're talking about the intersection of the two. So I want to do mostly listening because I can't even imagine the degree of courage, the degree of strength, and the degree of commitment that it takes for both Shelley and Sherry to be here today, and to be here on other days. I know this is the first time for them speaking publicly. I want you to know you're helping people out there more than I ever could, by your presence and by your willingness to tell your story under the most difficult of circumstances I've never faced. So I can't even imagine what you've been through. There are numbers, I guess there are lots of numbers we could talk about. The two that jumped out at me, just reading the summary of a report recently and also looking at some Pennsylvania data. I think the Pennsylvania number is 591 from 03 to 12, so basically a little more than a decade, 591 domestic violence homicides in Pennsylvania, more than half of which committed with a gun. Another number talks about 11 times more gun violence against women than in other countries. But here's the one that really floored me, and so many of these numbers are compelling. But if we don't remember 591, maybe we should remember this number. This is from a report in 2014, Center for American Progress. And I'll read it verbatim. Quote from 2001 through 2012, again, roughly the same time period. 6,410 women were murdered in the United States by an intimate partner using a gun. More than the total number of U.S. troops killed in action during the entirety of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars combined. 6,410 women. So whether it's 6,410 in that time period, nationally, just a horrible, horrible number. Or 591 victims of domestic homicides in the state in a similar time period. We've got to act, or we've got to continue to act. I know some people in this audience, in addition to the panel, have done a lot of work already. But we've got to make this a much higher priority issue, and especially the connection between domestic violence and gun violence. Here's the bill, and look, I cite this bill that I support, introduced by Senator Klobuchar. Amy Klobuchar was a prosecutor in Minnesota, in a major county there, Hennepin County. She was a prosecutor for years before she got elected to the U.S. Senate. So she saw a lot of this up close as a prosecutor. This bill is pretty simple, but even if we passed it, it won't be enough. Okay, and we know how long bills can take to pass. Because more than legislation, more than policy, we've got to make sure that this becomes part of our culture. Fighting against it and reducing the numbers and protecting the victims becomes part of our culture as citizens, not simply as elected officials. So on the one hand, we can't absolve ourselves of doing something in terms of policy, but on the other hand, we know that policy is not going to be enough. Here's what we want to do. We want to make sure that in the definition of intimate partner, that you expand that definition in the current law to include someone who's a dating partner. So in other words, that you don't just have protection, or intimate partner isn't only limited to some people who are married. We want to enlarge that definition. Shouldn't be a hard thing to do, but as you know in Washington, everything's hard. And then the other part is to say that if someone is convicted of a misdemeanor stalking crime, that they can have access to a firearm. And it says that this provision is similar to a bill that I have in the context of gun violence, where I believe we've got to crack down on it and be much more determined to stop hate crimes that involve the use of force at the misdemeanor level. So this focus on misdemeanors is very, very important, because if you're engaging in stalking enough to have been convicted up to the level of a misdemeanor, you're probably going to continue that stalking despite that conviction. If you get a gun and you're a stalker, we know that so many of these crimes are stalking leads to death in many instances. So they're two small changes, but they're very important to plug some of the holes, and we'll talk more about them. But I guess, Heidi, the one thing I wanted to open it up, and I want to open up to everyone on the panel. Just in terms of policy, even at the state level, Bob Freeman's here and others at the local level, just in terms of policy, what would you hope we could do? And obviously Lori and others who want to comment on this. And then I guess that's kind of a policy question, and then for the panel, but maybe more particular for Shelley and Sherry, are there, because you have been victims, are there things that you would hope that we would do, services or other opportunities that would be available to you that maybe you didn't have, or opportunities you didn't have that maybe we could provide for some others? So kind of a policy question, as well as the question of what we can do more even beyond policy.